Good morning, everybody. I'm Melanie Loisum, Commissioner of the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and co-chair of the Maine Climate Council, joined today by my co-chair, Hannah Pingree, Director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. It is great to see you all here today. Really appreciate you taking the time to spend this day with us. Unfortunately, I have to say I'm glad to be inside with you all today because of the extreme heat that we're expecting all across the state. And so just wanted to acknowledge that much like the storms that we saw this winter, that we are continuing to see the drastic effects of climate change across the seasons here in Maine. All right, so now I'm going to try to fumble through some slides, which means I have to figure out if I got the right button. Last time it was the big green button, but apparently
I think it is the big green button.
It's not the big green button. What do I have to point at?
Here, I got
Top
you.
button.
Try this.
Oh, thank you, the bigger green button. All right. Apparently he's not the big green button, but he did make it work. All right. So we do have a full agenda today. We're going to be first doing a brief overview of our strategies from the 2020 plan, Maine Won't Wait. Then we're going to be hearing presentations from several of our working groups, presenting their recommendations, reflecting all the work that those groups have been doing over the last few months. Then we'll have a break. You're going to hear some more presentations. We'll also be hearing presentations from our task force. We'll have a great lunch break, and then after that, we're going to have a chance for some discussion. So we'll break up into groups, and then we'll have a panel. So hopefully we'll have some time to hear some reflections from you all about what you've heard this morning as we present on the recommendations from the working groups. So just a look back and looking at our time frame for the work that's been happening. In December 2020, we published a comprehensive plan for climate action, Maine Won't Wait. And the work that we're doing now is not to replace that plan. What we're talking about is an update to that plan. So Maine law requires every 4 years we update the plan. And so as you're hearing the recommendations from our working groups today, remember that we're not going to be talking about absolutely everything that we need to be doing for climate action because we already covered a lot in that 2020 plan. What we're going to be talking about are some of the additional strategies and some of the evolution of those strategies looking forward for the next 4 years. So in May of 2023, the governor appointed the members of the Climate Council and our work began. For many months through the fall and the spring, our working groups have been meeting, coming up with recommendations for the Climate Council to then consider over the summer and this fall, and ultimately we'll have the new updated plan due December 1st of 2024. So in Maine Won't Wait, in the 2020 plan, we have 8 strategies for climate action. And I know you're all familiar with these, so I won't read them to you, but just a reminder that these strategies are still the strategies that we're looking toward when we think about how to take action to combat climate change, when we think about policies and investments to try to address the problems that we're seeing across our state that are caused by climate change. So as we think about the recommendations that you're going to hear this morning and this afternoon from our working groups, remember we're focused on the goals that were established in statute. And so with each of our 4-year planning cycles, those same goals are our guide to figuring out where we should be focusing. Number 1 is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We also want to make Maine more resilient to the effects of climate change. And we want to do those things at the same time as fostering economic prosperity and opportunity, and also to advance equity across our state. DEP has just released an update to our biennial greenhouse gas emission inventory. This is what we use to measure our progress towards our emission reduction goal. Happy to say that we have lowered emissions 30% since 1990, which is a great accomplishment, but we do still have more work to do. That's 15% more reductions that are needed to meet our 2030 goal. So that's a near-term goal with quite a bit work left to do to get there. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we've already seen the destructive effects of climate change on Maine. And so we can't focus just on emission reductions. We have to think about what we can do now to deal with the changes that we're already experiencing. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Pingree to talk about the structure of the Climate Council, our working groups, and to reflect on some of the work that's been happening.
Great. She's leaving the stage. You're not going to stay. You can stay. You can do whatever you want, Melanie. Well, thank you again. It's great to see a great crowd here today. Again, huge thanks to the Climate Council and the co-chairs who are seated up front, this is the day when all the work gets passed off to you, but we're also here to thank the hundreds of people in this room, the staff and working group members and task force members who have done all the work to get us here to this day. So I actually want to start out by first thanking the chairs and the members of the science, the STS, the Science and Technical Subcommittee. They are mostly seated there. Susie's somewhere else. Where's Susie? Maybe she's not here today. We have Ivan Fernandez and Steve Dixon. They both, with many, many other people, some whom are in this room, have helped to put together what we think is the basis of the climate plan. We want to build it on science and facts about where we are, what Maine is experiencing, and what we will experience in the future. And so I will just say this group works for big pay, which is volunteers, to do an enormous amount of heavy lifting on top of their day jobs. And the report, which is now out today and on the Climate Council's website, as well as an executive summary, is incredibly robust. It includes new conclusions, including on the impacts on human beings in our state, public health. They have done 3 webinars that got a lot of good attention. So if you haven't followed the work of the STS and you're trying to learn about climate science, just huge thank you to them for all of their heavy lifting. I will say that Steve is retiring from state service from the Maine Geological Survey. So I really just actually want to take a moment and thank him for his heavy lifting. And they know their work is not done because we all keep asking them questions all the time. And I'm sure Steve will keep getting those questions in retirement. So again, we're here today. We have the Science and Technical Subcommittee, the Equity Subcommittee, as well as the 6 working groups. And you're going to hear from the 6 working groups today. You're also going to hear from 2 task force groups, the Materials Management, Trash and Waste Group that Melanie helped co-chair. You're going to hear recommendations today, something that was not part of the last climate plan, which is important for inclusion in this climate plan. We also had a land use task force, sort of a lot of the co-chairs came together thinking about the intersection of land use. So you'll hear more about that today. I want to quickly just give a few more words about equity because it's an ongoing process. As a reminder, in terms of this climate plan to incorporate equity into the working groups, each working group had 2 equity experts to serve on the group to ensure that equity was part of the recommendations. We wanted to make sure it was included and robust, but we don't end there. I think as many of you know, the Mitchell Center at the University of Maine has continued to work to collect input from members of priority populations to inform the climate plan, and they will continue to be holding focus groups and conversations throughout the summer. We thank them for the heavy lifting so far and know that there is still work to do. You will see in all of the recommendations today preliminary input from these conversations that will be part of the presentations. You'll hear how each working group is thinking about equity, thinking about equity metrics, how we ensure that our recommendations are bold. And the Climate Council will again hear more in September for the final report coming from the Mitchell Center, as well as some of the other inputs that are coming. Separately, I also want to share a little bit about state tribal consultation and the Maine Climate Council. The state of Maine and tribal leaders are planning now for discussions about how we can support government-to-government consultations and agreements with the Wabanaki tribes on climate and energy issues, seeking opportunities to collaborate and support mutual priorities where possible. I don't know if she's here yet, but I know Ambassador Molly Bryant will be here today. And she is an incredibly important leader in these discussions with both me and Commissioner Loisem as co-chairs, and we are grateful for her continued leadership and her willingness to engage at this government-to-government level on how we can best continue to navigate the path forward with all of the Wabanaki nations on climate issues. We look forward to sharing more about a framework for collaboration on these issues at the September meeting. So more on that to come. I do want to just give a little bit more about the Maine Climate Council by the numbers. This is something I think all of you and your tired Zoom screens and your drives to Augusta or other parts of the state. I know that the Buildings Working Group took some fun field trips, so I don't know if anybody else take any fun field trips. Oh, Coastal and Marine did. They learned about lobster processing. But there were 100 Maine Climate Council and working group meetings between September 2023 and June 2024. It's a terrible government statistic that we judge our work in meetings. And so I only want to actually celebrate all of you who have put in a ton of time. We have 222 working group members. We have calculated that, you know, if you actually showed up to the meetings, which many of you did show up to the vast majority of the meetings, we would have 7,300 hours of participant time put into what you were going to hear today. I'm also incredibly grateful to the hundreds of members of the public who are on Zoom today listening to this meeting, who attended your meetings, who gave public comments. I think we feel incredibly bolstered by the fact that the public is paying attention, they care about the work that we're doing, and we will continue to ensure that the public is engaged throughout the summer. So to that end, we'll keep showing you this throughout the day. It's on the internet as well. We have launched a Maine Climate Council survey where we are asking the public, anybody who wants to weigh in, if you're a working group member who wants to kind of really weight one of your strategies, you can vote again. But we have a survey where we're asking people to weigh in and give input on the recommendations that we are considering today. The job of the Climate Council is to figure out how to put all these recommendations together, how to prioritize them. There are not unlimited resources. We have more resources certainly than the first time we put this plan together, especially because of federal government funding, but we still need to prioritize. So the public input that we get through this survey, we're going to take this on the road with some public meetings later this summer. It's incredibly important to the Climate Council process to make sure that we know where the people of Maine stand. So I'm going to end it there. We're going to pass it off to the working groups. I just want to give one last thank you. In addition to all of the heavy lifting the policy participants put in, I actually want to thank David Plum and the CBI team, who will be doing a lot of heavy lifting and did a ton of heavy lifting with staff throughout this process. So big thank you to David and all the other members of the CBI team. I want to thank the AV team who's back here, who I won't jinx. The last time we had a few failures, but it wasn't their fault. We had electrical issues, and they've gotten them all solved. So thank you guys so much for being here very bright and early to make this happen. I want to thank the staff of the Augusta Civic Center, and I also want to thank the GoPIF and state staff who have worked so hard, who are here at 7 a.m., setting everything up. This day would not happen without them. And I actually just want to close, actually it's a perfect handoff to the Community Resilience Working Group. Yesterday, the governor announced, I think as many people know, in the last climate plan, we said it's incredibly important to support communities as they take climate action. They need support planning, they need support prioritizing, and then they need funding to actually do these projects. So in 2021, we launched the Community Resilience Partnership Program with the goal of getting at least 100 communities engaged. Yesterday, the governor's announcement put 54 new grant awards out to Maine communities, and we now have 226 towns across Maine, municipalities and tribes participating in this program. So huge thanks to GoPIF and a lot of other folks in this room, as well as the legislators who appropriate the funding so we can support communities in what was a really exciting announcement. The only other thing I want to say is that next week, the Shore Harbor Planning Grants and Coastal Communities Fund that Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and the Coastal Program, they will be announcing 11 more grants to communities next week. So I just want to say that the work that we're all doing is yielding actual support to towns and action on the ground. And that is, I think, really the reason we're all here today. So with that, I will pass it back to David and appropriately the Community Resilience Working Group.
Okay, as I'm saying a few words, I'll invite the co-chairs of this block of presentations to come up. You know who you are. If you don't, it's... Could I invite actually the coastal marine folks up as well, and the natural and working lands folks, and Melanie, if you're going to do materials management, if you want to come up as well. And we'll all be here. Just careful in that last seat on the edge there. Don't scooch too far to the left. Okay, so we're getting into the meat of our work now. And the meat of our work is all the heavy lift, I love that expression that Hannah uses, of 6 working groups and a task force and another small task force on coming up with recommendations for you all, climate counselors, to consider. Do we have enough chairs? Great. All right. Let me just say 2 things before I turn it over to your co-chairs of the Community Resilience Working Group. One is, on your tables, you have some handouts. And the handouts you have on your tables, one is what I'm calling a notes-taking template. And it has a bunch of empty space throughout that document. And this is our attempt to say, memory is fragile. Go ahead and write down things you don't want to forget. And it'll be helpful not only tomorrow, but also in September as the council reconvenes and starts to make sense of all these recommendations and make it into a coherent plan. So that's your notes-taking template. The other document you have in front of you is a printout of all the recommendations you're going to hear today, but just at the most high level, the sort of high-level recommendation altitude. And that will be helpful as a memory crutch, again, to remember what you heard from all these co-chairs. The final thing that's in your tables are copies of Maine Won't Wait, the plan that was originally released in December 2020. So those are all materials to help you listen and to help you make sense of the enormous amount of interesting information you're about to hear. Okay, one more thing. We've told co-chairs that they have 10 minutes to synthesize 6 months worth of work in all those hours that you saw on the thing. So that is a bold request, and we do it with humility and also with a sense of grace. So I'm not going to cut you off. However, you do have a little timer, so just that little, like, take a peek down there, all right? Okay, I think that's all I need to say. And so why don't I invite Judy and Becca to come up. I'll let you introduce yourselves. And let's hear about what happened in the Community Resilience Working Group. Big green.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. My name's Judy East, Bureau Director for Resource Information and Land Use Planning at DACF. I'm with my co-chair, Becca Boulos, from the Maine Public Health Association. And I'd like to acknowledge that our third co-chair, Annie Fuchs, was not able to be here today. She took over halfway through from Sam Roy, who started out as our co-chair when he shifted from MEMA over to USGS. So thanks to Sam for that launch. I'd also like to recognize the staff that helped us out, Coastal Fellow Rachel Hamilton, Climate Change Specialist Nathan Robbins, and Senior Climate Planner David Ludwig, and our extraordinary facilitator, Melanie Garate. Thank you so much, Melanie. Okay. This is our working group. You'll notice that it is very large and very well qualified. They were also extraordinarily well engaged. Our process was to start with a survey across all of the members so we could scope out where we would focus our work. We ended with a survey as well once we had our final recommendations to review what we had prepared and to fine-tune, ensure we didn't lose anything. In the middle, we broke into about 4 subgroups, each one of which would present to the working group to provide us all a foundation of the same substance. Their preliminary recommendations, we had back and forth conversation about those recommendations. The subgroups went off, refined those recommendations, then that final survey fine-tuned them, and then we pulled them all together. The amazing working group that we had, just absolutely phenomenal engagement. This is a summary of our recommendations. I would say that 1 and 5, that is empowering local and regional efforts, and the funding issue are really a reboot with additional recommendations from before. Number 3 and number 6, that is establishing a metrics framework and looking at the impacts of mental health from climate change, are new this time around. The enhancing of state and local abilities to assess climate risks, I won't read that whole thing. That's also a new effort for better integration. And then number 4 there, improving information and education. I would add the words engagement and communication. Those topics and concepts run through all of our recommendations. So digging in a little bit first on the empowering of local and regional resilience efforts, the full spectrum we're referring to here takes you from avoidance, protection, adaptation, and we also added retreat this time, and I'll get into that in a little bit later. Capacity issues we talked about across multiple levels, the need for data. Some of these things are pretty obvious. Avoid development in high-risk locations, consider climate risks with infrastructure decisions. The devil is in the details. Our report is 56 pages long. I highly recommend you take a look at those. I'm not going to go into each one today. Obviously, there's recommendations around data, and we do advance nature-based solutions. Looking a little more in depth at this enhancement of state and local and regional abilities across the spectrum, again, assessment, preparation, recovery, and adaptation. We have recommendations around assessments, especially in recognition of some of the things that we encountered with the disasters of this past winter. There are multiple public health risks that we speak to, issues around infrastructure improvements, and this area of getting out of harm's way. That's the retreat strategy across the spectrum, which brings up emotional, financial, fiscal, historical, attachment issues to place that is incredibly fraught and complex. We have recommendations around skilled facilitation to address those issues, as well as exploration of a voluntary buyout program. I'll just point out the enhanced hazard mitigation, planning, response, and recovery. All those commas and the "and" make a difference, because we have a multitude of recommendations around better integration of those who do resilience planning with those who do emergency management planning and response. And before I pass to Becca, I'll just mention that we recommend establishing a framework for the metrics of how well we're doing, and that the references in our document are extensive across all of our recommendations. The metrics will probably run with cross-cutting to other of the working groups. They obviously adjust over time, and there are in those references state and national examples that we can go from. Over to you, Becca. 5 minutes and 5 seconds.
You did so well. Thank you, Judy. That was very well done. So in the context of improving information and education about climate and health, our broad strategy really is about improving the quality of public health data, as well as our response to those data across the state, so that we improve our capacity to appropriately identify and address emerging climate-related issues. We also aim to increase awareness and understanding of those issues, and to make sure that people have equitable and easy access to the resources they need to respond. As an example, we want to raise awareness about the increased risk of mold after severe weather events like the most recent back-to-back storms, and make sure that people know how to either remediate on their own or access affordable services in a reasonably timely manner. In the context of expanding access to funding and financing for climate adaptation and emissions reduction, the broad strategy is about developing a comprehensive, multi-pronged, and long-term funding plan and investment strategy to support the implementation of Maine Won't Wait. And that includes how to make funding opportunities more efficient and more accessible for more communities, and maximize opportunities for federal investments. In this strategy alone, we provide 17 recommendations, so there's no shortage of ideas for the Climate Council to consider. In the context of increasing awareness and action on the mental health impacts of climate change, the broad strategy is about recognizing, uplifting, and responding to the mental health impacts of climate change through increased resilience, hope, agency, and community connectedness. More specifically, we recommend the establishment of a climate psychology task force, which can help inform multi-level investments and comprehensive training and resources for people across the state, including first responders and healthcare professionals, and especially for those who are most impacted by climate change, including youth. Through the University of Maine Mitchell Center's Equity Engagement Project research, this quote was captured from one of the participants. Quote, "When asked open-ended questions about their most pressing needs, survey respondents do not cite climate change, but nearly always point to challenges that are related to climate, such as high fuel costs or competing challenges such as a lack of childcare," end quote. This very much matches conversations we had in our working group about recognizing and endeavoring to respond to other determinants of people's health, especially for populations most impacted by climate change and with the least resources to respond. We discussed how our proposed strategies can also include improvements to processes, like funding applications, which can serve as a barrier, but really should serve as a facilitator for people and communities to get the support they need when they need it. These are examples of other competing priorities and barriers, including the cost of living, transportation, funding, and disillusionment. For us to be successful at supporting the people most impacted by climate change, we have to consider these other determinants of health. This is where intentional, collaborative, cross-sector work, both within state government and with external partners, particularly with impacted communities, is important. And lastly, I'll just reiterate, as Judy mentioned, we have a very comprehensive report with many more ideas, including a lot of references, with a table of contents. You can click through and see what you want to read. So please do take the time to do that. And I have 52 seconds left, so there's that.
Wonderful. Setting the example. Okay. Kurt and Carl, I'll invite you. You're up next, and I'll let you introduce yourselves and your working group. So come on up.
I think when the green button is advanced.
Top green. Big play.
The big play. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Carl Wilson. I'm the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Marine Science and the Department of Marine Resources. I'm co-chair of our Coastal Marine Working Group with Kurt Brown with Ready Seafood, lobsterman scientist, and also seen on QVC as well. It was an absolute honor to work with our working group over the last 6 to 8 months. We have over 40 members coming from a diverse background and experiences. And we very quickly moved from individual. Thank you. We very quickly moved from individual agendas and experiences to where our group was thinking. And I just really want to thank the working group for kind of working towards a common goal. And I think in the end, we had 3 very clear themes that were brought forward, and I would like to think that they were supported by the vast majority of our working group. I do want to call out a special thank you to Jess Waller with the Department of Marine Resources. She really provided the backbone of the staff for our working group, and Laura Singer, who provided facilitation services. Without either of them, we would not have been here today. Also want to call out Edge Venuti, who is our youth representative. Edge attended almost every single meeting that we held. And I know that as someone who used to be her age a long time ago, To be sitting at the table with 40 professionals in the field is very intimidating, but it's also very impactful. And I know when I had similar experiences, those experiences carry through throughout your career. And so I know Edge is here today. So thank you for working with us. Also want to call out Gabe McPhail and Marissa McMahon for representing our group within the equity committee. And equity is an issue that we actually talk quite a bit about within our working group, and it's an issue that will continue into the future. So to tee up our conversations, we have really moved forward with 3 large themes, and shortly after the January storms, we had a kind of an impromptu call with Kurt and a few other people, and we said, well, I think we know what our first bullet point will be, and that is talking about infrastructure in our coastal communities. Quite literally, as we were on the phone, parts of our infrastructure were floating out to sea. And so we do want to advance, one large kind of bold prediction or bold call to say we need to invest in our coastal infrastructure significantly in order to harden the coast of Maine against climate change and rising sea level. Both Kurt and I, with our experiences over our careers, I think we talk a little bit more about supporting climate adaptation around fisheries and monitoring. These are both subjects that are kind of near and dear to both of our hearts. But with that, I will let Kurt take over.
Thank you, Carl. You got it? All right. Clock is ticking. Show of hands. Who knows what QVC is? One of those. Do a lot of education outreach, and none of the kids we talk to have any idea. But yeah, I mean, when we think about the work over the last 7-8 months, it's really incredible what we've seen as a state and the impacts, the storms of January, both 10th and 13th. And I think we all have very vivid memories from those 2 days about what we saw. Myself personally, it was the first time I have ever seen water come up over Deeks Wharf, where I keep my boat, and then the flood of images, no pun intended, but the flood of images coming from around the coast of docks literally getting washed away, and anything that survived the 10th getting culled out on the 13th. And so our big priority really came out of those 2 storms and building healthy and, oh, we already clicked it, excellent, healthy and resilient coastal communities and protect critical place-based infrastructure. You can see all the different aspects of that on the slides there. I won't go into too many details because we are we're at 5 minutes right now, but in addition to what's on the slide, and this was our big priority for sure, the storms really changed our working group priorities. Like I said, watching water overtop just about everything along the state was an eye-opener for all of us, and out of that came our big ask, our big recommendation. We were told to think big, and I think $100 million over 5 years investment in infrastructure to make our coastline more resilient is a real key priority for our group. And in addition to that, supporting municipalities and inventorying what currently exists, identifying priority resources, and comprehensive planning are all key as well. And so that was our big one coming out of our group. And again, it was a really humbling experience being part of such an amazing working group with so many great minds. And we covered a lot of ground over 8 months. And I'll turn it back over to Carl for our second priority. Big green.
Yeah. And I would say, with the suggestion of a major investment in our coastal infrastructure, this is our attempt to fight back around climate change. If our coastal communities and our fisheries are going to continue, we need to be able to support them with the docks and the bait supply houses and the infrastructure to ship their product around the coast. And without this investment, we lack that ability to fight back. And I think we saw that in January, and it clearly is a call. So when it comes to fisheries, what we're talking about is being nimble and adaptive as we move forward. New species are coming onto the radar screen, and other species are dropping off the radar screen. An example would be black sea bass, where we have occasional reports of black sea bass, which is a healthy, profitable fisheries in other parts of the Atlantic coast, that we have occasional reports. We have no markets for them. We have a very small quota, and we have no monitoring programs to actually monitor the species that might be coming into coastal waters. And so it's just an example of we need to be nimble. We need to be able to move forward in a way that allows us to work within some of the structures that we already have. Another issue that came through with fisheries conversation is around equity and access. The changes that I think everyone in Maine have felt during the pandemic as far as just the housing squeeze that we now see, that has direct implications for participants within our coastal fisheries. Meredith White from the Department of Marine Resources, I thought, brought an excellent example when we have an important heritage fishery like the clam industry and harvesters that obtain licenses through municipalities are struggling to live in the municipalities, what they would train. And so it's just a slow pushing away from the traditional nature of some of our fisheries. I'll pass this off to you, Kurt. Thank you.
Before we move on to the next one, you can see marine bioproduct innovation there, and I think that's a key component into really a healthy future for a lot of Maine's marine industries. When we had a fun field trip, like Hannah mentioned, to our facility in Saco where we process lobster. And when you process lobster, you may buy a pound of lobster, but only sell half that maybe. The rest could be considered a waste stream. And there are so many opportunities in Maine's marine industries to turn those waste streams into revenue streams. And that's where collaboration really comes in. We're working with fun projects with the University of Maine on incorporating shells into soil for potato plants and increasing their disease resistance. We're working on a really fun project with some folks down at the University of Maryland, converting lobster shells and utilizing them for zinc-ion batteries for large-scale grid storage. So that type of expertise, which is here in this room, helps everybody move forward and build a more resilient marine economy. And speaking of collaborative research, I think both Carl and I have a research bias, and initially our priority was probably monitoring when it comes to the Gulf of Maine. Obviously, we're seeing fundamental changes, but without documenting those changes, we...
Forward you one slide.
That's the big green one. Thank you. Without that monitoring, we can't make informed decisions. So I think we landed on how important that is going forward, and that ultimately will be a collaboration between industry and science. And the state has such a strong foundation of that collaborative nature. The department does an amazing job of collaborating across many different spheres. And so that data collection is going to be a key component of all that. And I'll let Carl speak to the department's vision on that. But from a lobster perspective, one of the really great things that came out of the whale issue was funding for basic research throughout the Gulf of Maine, not just on whales, but on the entire ecosystem. So out of that issue, we were able to improve our understanding, and we currently are doing that with science that the department is doing on all aspects of the entire ecosystem. So.
Okay, Kurt, this is actually your quote to go from. So
If you wanted to touch out, we're at 0. So this is a good one. So this is a quote from somebody out of Spruce Head. We've always had storms, but storms are more out of the south and southeast now. And out of that direction, a lot of our harbor is unprotected. May not seem like a big difference between a nor'easter and a sou'easter, but that 90-degree difference in wind direction piles water up in areas, especially during the winter, that we are not used to. I mean, Winter Harbor is named Winter Harbor because it is in the lee out of the nor'east. Out of the sou'east, it puts a whole slew of infrastructure at risk, and that's exactly what we saw in December, in January multiple times, and even in April. You forget about all the storms we've had over the course of the last year, but those southeast storms during the winter, especially when we're talking about precipitation in the form of rain and not snow, does an unmeasurable amount of damage, and that's something we're going to have to continue to prepare for into the future.
Okay, and I think that emphasizes our final point here is when we reflect back on priority populations, having reflected back to us a little bit. One thing that I would say is that our group, and if you've ever worked with Kathleen Billings, you know that she kind of tells you the way it is. And Kathleen really brought forward to our group the municipal experience where, Kathleen and the town of Stonington have been engaged with climate conversations for quite some time, but not all communities have been, and there's a real need to support those communities. And so I just really appreciate the grounding that Kathleen brought to our group. So to kind of wrap this up, I also just want to thank Kurt as a co-chair. If you know Kurt, you know that he is on the move all the time. And for Kurt to bring his leadership and work to this working group really added to the robustness, and it added a kinetic energy of actually bringing our working group to place of business, bringing fishermen to our table and describing their experiences. And so just want to thank you, Kurt. So appreciate it. I think we're done.
Thank you both. Okay. I'll invite our co-chairs from the Natural Working Lands to come up now, and I'll let you introduce yourselves. Thanks so much. And it has been clear it's this topic.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Beal. I'm the Commissioner of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and I've been co-chairing the Natural and Working Lands group for 5.5 years now, or something like that. But I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he's going to start with the first few slides.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Abello, and I'm the co-chair with Commissioner Beal. I've been the co-chair with her since the beginning, about 5+ years, and it's been a really great experience, and really appreciate Hannah with the nomination of the both of us to this work group. It's been a really challenging and fun experience. Here's the list of our members, and so it's a big group, a lot of experts in their fields, a really cohesive group. We've worked together a lot, and it's gone, I think, really, really well. In order to take a deeper dive into our recommendations, what we decided to do was to split our group up into 3 subgroups that would tackle each one of the recommendations and then report back to our larger group periodically over the course of many months of work. And so I want to thank everyone for their time and their efforts. I also want to thank Jody Sapphire, who was our facilitator, and there is no way that we could be where we are today without her. She kept the trains running on time. She kept Amanda and I focused on moving the ball forward, and so really appreciate all of her efforts, and also Tom Gordon from DACF staff, who was kind of our nut and bolt IT guy. So as I mentioned, so we focused on 3 elements of our original recommendations. We wanted to take deeper dives into those, and so Amanda and I are going to walk through these in more detail, but number 1 is to increase by 2030 the total acreage of conserved natural working lands to 30%. Number 2, increase the amount of food consumed in Maine to 30%. And then finally, our 3rd recommendation is to build the amount of forest carbon on private and public lands.
Yeah, so as you can see, we really came at this work thinking about how our natural resource base is just such an incredible asset for us in our state, both for mitigation and adaptation. And these were 3 goals that, as Tom said, we pulled these from. These were our goals that were embedded in the original climate action plan, and we just really knew they needed more work, and we needed to do a deeper dive and get down into them. So that's what we did. And I also will just say that reflecting upon all of these big storms we had over the winter and spring, it was really impactful. As you can imagine, in our department, we have all the state parks and public lands, inland, coastal, of course, agriculture, forestry. there was a lot of damage that got done that will take years for us to recover from. And these associated industries as well have really sustained some challenges. So it's so important to us that we take these recommendations forth and with the weight of how important they are. So make sure I'm advancing my slides here. This first goal around increasing by 2030 the total acreage of conserved natural and working lands in the state to 30%. This is a really big goal. When we first set this the first time around, we didn't really have time to dig down into what would it take to get there, what would it take to do that. And so by conserved, we're talking about mostly voluntary purchases of land and working forest and farmland easements. Right now, as a state, we're at about 22%, just over 22% of our land is conserved. But we need to look under the hood because we're doing really a good job in certain types of conservation, but in others, such as farmland protection, we're sort of way behind. In fact, only about 3.5% of our agricultural soils, our best farms, are protected at this point in time. So we really need to pick up the pace. At our recent pace, we've been protecting around 50,000 acres annually. In order to reach this 30% number by 2030, we would have to increase that rate fivefold. And so, as you can imagine, that requires capacity to do that. It requires money, resources, funding. And we have a specific goal to get at that low percentage of farmland that's protected to double farmland that is protected by 2030 as well, embedded in that 30% goal. So to do that, back of the envelope calculations, we were coming up with a number of around between farmland and other types of conservation around $70 million a year. That's a big number. It's not necessarily all going to need to come from the state. There are some good programs that we can tap into at the federal level and other types of funding where we can get matching funds for the work that we do. We already do quite a bit of that, and we just need to do more of it. So for the next slide, the next goal is to increase the amount of food consumed in Maine from state producers to 30% by 2030. And I should say, actually, I meant to mention when I was talking about the 30% lands goal, just a shout out to Andy Cutco from the Bureau of Parks and Lands in our department and Adam Bishop from Maine Farmland Trust for co-chairing that subcommittee. They did an excellent job. And for our 30% food subcommittee, Craig Lapine, who is our Bureau Director for the Bureau of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Resources in my department as well, and Brittany Peets, who also works with Craig. They did a great job tag teaming on that as facilitators as well. So when we talk about food and how we grow our food, where it comes from, there are just a lot of different mitigation and adaptation elements we can really look at. And for example, just by supporting climate smart agricultural practices and increasing the amount of food that we're consuming locally, so it's not coming from far, far away. It also gives us the opportunity to really have more control over our climate-related footprint that's associated with food production. So again, climate smart practices and doing other things like paying attention to food waste and all of those things are part of that picture. And we also can decrease our dependence on fragile global supply chains, which will remain vulnerable to climate-related shocks as we go forward. And we all experienced a little bit of that during COVID. There's also been that going on in the background with climate impacts as well. And if we're going to see more volatile patterns, then it's logical that we'll see more disruption there as well. And then one of the other things I'll call out is that we did talk about the importance of creating a Maine food plan. We are one of the, I think we might be the only New England state that doesn't have a food plan for our state. This is a good opportunity to put something together that we can measure and use to track our progress and really look at the food system as a whole system and to be able to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities and really work toward a common outcome. There is an opportunity on the forefront for us to do this work. The state can be, involved in helping to really make this happen. The University of Maine is in a great position to help make this happen, and many, many other supporting entities. And it also provides an opportunity for us to just sync up with other recent state plans that have already been created to address hunger, promote seafood, and grow our economy. And just to call it out, I want to make sure people know we know that seafood is part of our food system and a really important part. And so that was at the heart of our conversations as well. I'll turn it back to Tom because he actually co-chaired the next working group, or the subcommittee that he'll talk about the goal for.
Thank you. Number 3, develop new incentives to increase carbon storage. I was the co-chair with Jody Sapphire. And so really what we did here, the overarching goal of this is to keep forests as forests. And as everyone knows in this room, Maine is the most forested state in the nation. We focused a lot and built off an earlier iteration of the Forest Carbon Task Force. We focused a lot on small to medium landowners. Those are, generally speaking, landowners who have between 10 and 10,000 acres. There's about 8,600 landowners in that cohort, 86,000 landowners in that cohort. And so it's a big focus area. We drilled down on a couple of different pieces. Number 1, incentives for landowners, loggers, and foresters, really to take action, to take additional steps with climate-friendly forest practices that they can make some money, generate some revenue, but at the same time build the carbon stocks on their property. Number 2 on this is around technical assistance and financial incentives and financial resources. There was some work at the legislature this past session around looking at one of the current use programs focused on open space and an effort there to try and get that modernized so that it would better address landowners who are interested in increasing carbon rather than keeping their land open. It's similar but a little bit different. And so we want to build off that too. And then another important piece here is developing markets for low-grade wood, because that's really a key piece in order to store carbon. Think of it as a garden where you're weeding the lettuce or weeding the carrots. You're sort of taking out some of the small ones so that more can grow bigger, and they'll be tastier and store more carbon down the road. So I think, too, another piece here that we talked about is building off of that small and medium landowner cohort into the large, more commercial landowners. We touched on that some. I think that's an area for development and discussion moving forward. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of programs for the large landowners. And so I think there's a role for the state in how we encourage and participate with the large landowners in storing carbon. I see that I'm out of time, so we'll stop there. But lastly, input from priority populations. We got a lot of good initial data from the Mitchell Center. There is a lot more left to be done, but the initial feedback that we heard based on their surveys and focus groups, number 1, barriers to natural working lands access. I think a key here is lack of information, the cost and transportation to those resources. So we want to drill down on that in the future. Barriers to natural resource industry careers. I think, we heard from the youth members that natural resources can feel isolated, and there's a lack of membership and guidance. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for us moving forward. How do we encourage more kids to get into these fields? And for new Mainers, language barriers, lack of transportation, and being unfamiliar with state resources. And then finally, challenges for accessing local food, hard to find culturally preferred food. And so that's an area for discussion and where we need to drill down with the Mitchell Center. Food deserts was also a theme. And then finally, for some, the price of local food. And I think that's an area where we need to get better about what that looks like. In certain areas, that may not be the case, but in other areas, that certainly is. And so that is where we are for now on that, but that is the end.
Thank you. Every time I hear these presentations, I think the amount of work that got done. Thank you. All right, so there was one, we're going to have one more here from this panel, and Melanie's going to talk about something that I used to call the waste task force, but got a more elegant name of materials management. So Melanie will tell us what's going on with that because it's new from the last climate plan.
Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm pleased to present the recommendations of the Materials Management Task Force on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Dr. Cindy Eisenhower from University of Maine, who was not able to join us today. The task force was established to examine how our use and waste of materials contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and to identify strategies to reduce those emissions from the waste sector, which contributes approximately 3% to our total greenhouse gas emissions in Maine. I'd like to thank everyone who participated on the task force, including representatives from businesses and organizations that represented each rung of the waste management hierarchy. The materials management hierarchy. So we used to call it waste, right? And now we're trying to recognize that one person's trash can be another person's treasure, and that those materials that we had been disposing of, we can make better use of. So you'll hear me go back and forth between waste and materials management. So the materials management hierarchy was established in Maine's Solid Waste Act to prioritize policymaking across all stages of materials management, from waste reduction and reuse to recycling and incineration, and ultimately, lastly, preferred landfilling. I'd also like to thank Megan Mansfield-Pryor, who was staff from GoPIF, who really handled everything in terms of facilitating this task force. Many thanks to Megan. And she also served as an expert herself on the topic. And a special shout out to our youth member, Maya Fullstitch, who knows from experience that showing up really does make a difference. She was an amazing participant on the working group, and like was recognized for other youth members. Just fantastic to have somebody who's got that much energy and bright new ideas to be part of the conversation. So thanks, Maya, for joining us. So the task force recommends 6 actions to improve how we manage materials to reduce wastes and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These recommendations connect with many of the other strategies in Maine Won't Wait and with recommendations from the other working groups. They are to evaluate our consumption-based emissions, grow Maine's circular economy, reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030, regionalize materials management services, reuse building materials, and reduce methane emissions. We were new, so we had lots of recommendations. We had a lot of pent-up energy and interest in materials management. We had to boil it down quite a bit just to get to these 6. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of these, but there's so much more supporting information behind all of them that will be accessible to the Climate Council members as you're considering these recommendations. So we've traditionally measured Maine's greenhouse gas emissions as those that are directly emitted within Maine's borders, otherwise known as our territorial emissions inventory. That's the one I referred to earlier, where we've achieved a 30% reduction since 1990. However, that method doesn't take into account many of the actions we take in Maine that affect other parts of the country or the world that do contribute to the global problem of climate change. So for example, when you choose to reuse a container that was made in China, that does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not counted in our inventory. Our collective consumption choices can have a meaningful impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and the task force recommends that moving forward, we also use a consumption-based inventory method to help us evaluate the greenhouse gas benefits of our material management strategies. The task force also strongly recommends strategies to promote a circular economy, where the value of materials is retained by reusing and recycling them for as long as possible to reduce the need for virgin materials. This includes supporting investments in reuse and refill infrastructure, such as container collection systems and washing facilities, which will also expand job opportunities. The state's Lead by an Example initiative should include procurement policies that give preference to reusable rather than disposable materials, and state funding should incentivize reuse and recycling over destruction of materials through incineration or landfilling. This will reduce both our territorial emissions and our consumption-based emissions. And I would also like to give thanks to the GoPIF staff and to the folks from the Augusta Civic Center. Just a shout out that you may recall from years ago when we did these events, we had lunches in boxes and huge piles of materials that were wasted at the end of these events. We're now using reusable coffee cups. We've got hot food that's going to be served on plates that will be washed, and also any of the food that's not consumed today will be donated to the Augusta Food Bank. So great change that we've made. The task force recommends setting a specific, aggressive goal to reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030. DEP did a recent study of food loss and waste, and we found that the largest contributors to food waste are, no surprise, residences, our own homes, food manufacturers, grocery stores, hotels, and restaurants. Greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced from the waste sector by maximizing food rescue and donation efforts, which will require increased education and outreach. We know that this is something that there is still some discomfort with. There have been changes to state policies to make sure that people understand this is something that can be done safely, but we want to continue to promote those efforts. This recommendation also aligns with Maine Won't Wait's recommendation that we should be working to feed hungry people. The distances between Maine's communities cause increased costs for and emissions from the transportation of wastes. Southern parts of Maine have more access to reuse and recycling services than the northern half of the state. The task force recommends increased coordination among local and regional facilities to scale up waste prevention and diversion services. And similar to recommendations from the Buildings Working Group, the task force recommends that building materials should be reused when possible to retain their embodied carbon through redevelopment or deconstruction rather than demolition. The task force also recommends planning for the impacts of storms on our built environment by establishing systems to collect storm debris and locations for the storage to sort it. And lastly, the task force also examines strategies to reduce emissions from landfills, which are reflected in Maine's greenhouse gas inventory. Landfills emit methane from decomposing wastes, which can be captured and used as an energy source. However, this is not a renewable energy source, and the task force recommends reevaluating if the use of renewable energy credits is really an appropriate incentive for gas capture. So, as I said before, this is a really brief summary of very lengthy and detailed recommendations with lots of supporting information about materials management in Maine. So I hope for all of you who have an interest in the topic, you will review that. And I did not use all my time.
Wow. One of the benefits of all of these great presentations staying more or less in time is that we can do two things. One, I'm going to ask a question of the panel. And then two, climate counselors, think of a question you might have for folks, because we do have a few minutes if you have a question for these panelists. All right? But my question, I'm going to go ask each of you to have a quick reflection on this, is you've been hard at work for 6 to 8 months on this. And I'm curious if there's a moment, like an aha moment or a big learning that you had in this process that helped shape this final thinking that you presented today. So if you think for just a moment, was there something that happened over those 6 months that really stood out for you personally and for the group that changed the course of how you did this work this time around? And we can start at the center of the table and work our way down. And these mics should work if you lean into them, maybe. They're on. Okay. I'll just lean right in.
Okay, thank you, David. And also for giving us this question ahead of time.
Yeah.
I think my aha moment was to hear that while we thought the addition of the retreat, getting out of harm's way strategy was important, we were hearing from the regional coordinators and from MEMA that communities themselves are asking for assistance in having those conversations. It's not just our idea. And that also, for me, underscored the relevance and significance of the mental health focus that we had on the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Becca.
I think for me, it was a conversation we were having in our working group about meeting with people in our communities to talk about climate change. And I'm looking at Dr. Tora Johnson because it was her story that really was my spark for this. But really just reflecting on, and we did share this in our recommendations, but the intersectionality of these issues and the competing priorities, like housing, like food insecurity, economic insecurity, and also violence prevention at the community level. Research shows that there's more violence in communities on higher heat days. And so really when we think about our response, we really need to have an intersectional, broader view of our efforts.
Thanks, Becca. Carl?
Yeah, at least for myself, it clearly came on the heels of the storms that hit the coast in early January. And really this feel of needing to fight back against climate change and some of the impacts along the coast, and just really taking that as a charge to move forward. It's not just sitting back and monitoring, it's fighting back.
Thanks, Carl. Kurt?
My head went right to the same place Carl's did, and standing January 10th right at Portland Headlight watching a wave crash up over the rocks and blow out the windows at that, iconic lighthouse. But then the more I thought of it, it went towards the presentation we had however many months ago where Susie Arnold talked about the science of hope around climate change and how that kind of changed my frame of reference. And while a lot of it is doom and gloom, there are opportunities to do positive things in the face of this. And I thought about how one of the members of our working group, Chuck Bennett, who's a multi-generational lobsterman from Sorrento, is getting involved with science in addition to going out on the water and harvesting. He's installing temperature sensors on a lot of his traps, helping to collect data that will inform decisions going forward. So that whole power of hope in the face of all this is something that I think is really important. And in the spirit of that, I was hoping Susie would be here, but I don't think she is. So, but that was really powerful.
Yeah. Thanks, Kurt. Amanda?
I think I turned it off.
Yeah.
There were so many takeaways through all these discussions, and I think the one that just really stands out to me the most is that figure that we would have to really pick up the pace of land conservation 5 times, greater than what we're doing right now. And what would that mean? What would that take? But also, what would we gain from that? And so I think there's so much to be gained that we just really need to figure that out.
Thanks. Tom?
Yeah, I think just to build on what Amanda said, that was one that I've been thinking about as well. It's about resources too, and about how much new money that we can bring to the table so that we can build on that and get to that 30% figure. It's been a high priority for the administration, where the governor put in $40 million a few years ago. That money is now spent, and so how do we move forward with an even bigger number in the remaining years of the administration? And then 2, I would just say, as I think about the forests of Maine and where things are headed, we know that that the species that we love today are changing, and that they won't be here in 100 or 200 years. You think about, softwoods like the pine, white pine, balsam fir, spruce, they're all migrating up. And so we kind of can conserve and protect the stage, but the actors will change over time.
So, Melanie?
I think the moment for me was when Dr. Reed Miller from University of Maine did a presentation and training on the consumption-based inventory. I've been working on Maine's territorial inventory for 16 years, and tracking our progress and personally assessing the work that we're doing against that, and realize that there are so many things, policy choices, strategies that we contemplate that we're not capturing with that analytical method, and that there are other ways that we can be measuring what we could do to make a contribution to reductions both nationally and globally, and not just here within our own state.
Thanks. And even though our statutory requirements in Maine are around that territorial inventory, that doesn't mean we can't look at the consumption-based
That's
piece
right.
too. Okay. So I wanted to create a moment, if there are counselors in particular or other co-chairs that had questions for this panel. Brian's got a mic. There might be another mic kicking around too. Yep, great. So we've got 2 mics. Any questions, reactions that you'd want to share with this panel before we take a break and do it all over again? This is a good chance to ask a question.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to help that out. Hi, y'all. Is this working?
There it is.
Thanks. Just giving the commissioner a hard time. But I'm going to bring you up here, so be nice to me.
Don't forget to introduce.
I'm Kate Dempsey, council member and state director for the Nature Conservancy. And there's a couple things that were my ahas. One is around the resilience working group and the coastal and oceans working group. I'm curious as whether there's a way to focus on mental health resources within fishing communities. You mentioned frontline workers, and it occurred to me that our fishing communities are frontline workers in a perhaps not what I normally think of when I hear that term. And then Brian knows that I'm a big advocate of road stream infrastructure, and we also saw those huge storms in December. So I'm also thinking of inland rural communities and how to focus on people trying to get to work at great distance. So you don't need to answer, but it was an intersection that struck me.
Although you could answer if you wanted to.
So I'll try a partial answer. One of the things that we didn't mention was that the Coastal and Marine and the Community Resilience Working Group actually got together to discuss our recommendations and shared drafts to ensure that we were working simultaneously, not at cross purposes, and the focus on mental health and developing a sense of agency over what we can do about this absolutely came up with the Coastal and Marine Working Group in fishing communities. So it's in there for sure, as well as it came up again in many more of our recommendations focused on inland and rural communities. So I think it's in there, and I'm delighted that you'll be searching for it.
Great. And Joyce Taylor and Jeff Crawford, when they come up and talk about transportation, maybe can jump on the culverts issue. Yeah.
First of all, on? It is on. Hello, you can hear me now. Hannah Pingree, great to see you all. Great job. So a lot of the recommendations, I think, the Climate Council is all sitting up front, and our job is to now take these recommendations and think about what's next. I think the exciting thing about the last plan that we are building on is that they immediately led to lots of people at the local level, towns, businesses, nonprofits, sort of helping to take these recommendations and running with them, you know, especially the private sector, the nonprofit sector. I think about hospitals, I think about businesses, schools. I wonder if you can each reflect on sort of what you hope when you think about some of your biggest recommendations. What would you love to see in like 2 years happening on the ground that state government's not doing, but some other, you know, private sector has really engaged in and started to build? Tom, I'm going to put you on the spot.
No, don't.
Some large landowners, big farms.
Yeah, I guess for me it would be the forest carbon space, and there are a lot of programs, voluntary programs, regulatory programs all throughout the country, and even at the international level. I would like to see some of that coalesce and get a little bit more mature so that Maine can better participate in it. It feels like it's kind of shifting sands right now, and it's hard to know what role, if any, the state should play, and I'm hoping that in a couple of years that'll be a little bit more baked.
This is a question for all of you.
Yeah. Feel free to jump in on that. Like, again, a lot of this is directed to state government, and what should other folks be doing with this?
Did you say you wanted to take it, or did you say you want me to take it? Let's both take it.
Okay.
Make sure
I mean,
that mic's on.
From my perspective, I think coming out of the pandemic, the fishing industry has just been faced with one whammy after another, whether it be the storms this winter or right whales or any number of issues. I mean, just yesterday we learned the preliminary assessment for Gulf of Maine cod, and the recommended catch is 90% lower than it has been in recent years. It's not final yet, but it's dire what some of our fisheries are going up against. And in the face of this, I think we've seen a rightful anger and pushing back from the fishing industry. And so what my hope would be is that we fight back together. The worst thing that we could have is kind of this polarization where the department really only succeeds when we're working with the fishing industry and moving in the same direction. And the issues are too big and the stakes are too high not to do that. And so I think we need to get back at the table and get conversations that are continuing, but they need to be reinforced. So I don't know.
No, that's spot on. And I think two takeaways for me were collaboration and communication, really where the rubber meets the road. We just saw a lot of words, and behind those words were a lot of ideas and a lot of work. But ultimately, if we can communicate and collaborate really, truly where the rubber meets the road, and I'm looking at you, Kathleen, and the commission that the governor just put together, the first meeting we had was right there at the co-op in Stonington. And that's a real, quick turnaround, but a good case study of what we can do as a state to build resilience and really adapt to what's going on.
Thanks. Anything else on that topic of what other actors you would like to see?
So I love the question, Hannah, and I'm thinking about it in the land use context and the housing crisis that we're facing. And I heard a segment a week or so ago from, I think it was Red Fern, their development company, where this fellow very articulately laid out that good growth strategies are climate strategies. Walkable, livable, wonderful, multi-use communities that address housing can be those that also address climate. And to hear that come from the private sector so articulately was wonderful, and I'd love to see more of that within communities and the development community.
Great.
I had one.
Yeah, Becca, go ahead, please.
So in the nonprofit world, a lot of times our funding is program specific or kind of really topic specific. And one thing I would love to see is an allowance for this more intersectional work. And so if you're working on housing and security, you also have a space to be working on climate related efforts. So I think looking to funders that support a lot of the nonprofits to be able to have kind of a wider lens in the work that we do.
Nice. Thanks, Becca. Melanie.
Our task force heard some presentations from really cool businesses that are doing refill of containers, reuse, and repair. And, those have formed all on their own. And, if I were to say what I would hope to see happen in the next 2 years is I would love to see increased demand in Maine for those kind of services across the state. That those are new businesses, those are new jobs, those are products and services being made and bought here in Maine. Just like we talk about buying food locally, wouldn't it be great to have these businesses enabling us to reduce the amount of waste we're generating by reusing the things that we're buying here in the state and creating new jobs as a part of that?
On that hopeful note, let's take a 20-minute break. We're going to be back here at 10:45. However, the most important thing to do is thank our presenters for giving us all this information. So we'll see you back here, 20-minute break. Folks online, we're just going to go quiet for a little bit and we'll see you back. Okay, so we're going to get going again. Thanks, everyone. I feel like there's so much good conversation that happens at these breaks. It pains me to cut them off. So, we'll be here for lunch too. We'll have a break in the afternoon. Take advantage of those conversations. For those online, it's a good incentive to come next time because there's a lot of interesting things that happen at the break. All right, so we're going to do another panel just like before. Same routine. We've got another 3 working groups plus Hannah Pingree is going to talk to us about land use. And we're going to start out with transportation. So I'll invite our co-chairs to introduce themselves, and away we go.
Yeah, we'll go.
Good morning. So far, a great session, and we will do our best to continue that. I'm Jeff Crawford. I'm the director of the Bureau of Air Quality, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Transportation Work Group. I'm joined this morning by Joyce Taylor, who is our other co-chair. Before we go on, I would be remiss if I didn't give special thanks to Sierra Millay, Jen Langland, who I don't believe is here. Both worked with Joyce at DOT, and really they are the brains behind the operation, if you will. They did a lot of our writing and plan development for us. And then finally, David Plum, who did a wonderful job facilitating. He's the best. Okay, we had a very diverse group of transportation work group members, everything from town managers, industry folks, environmental folks. It was a really good group. We had a lot of lively, not heated discussions, but a lot of lively discussions on the direction the transportation work group should go and what our recommendations should look like. I'm going to go over just the first one. Now, we had 3 recommendations. One was to accelerate light-duty vehicle electrification. Another one was to accelerate or produce VMT reductions. And then finally, the third major recommendation was to accelerate the adoption of medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Okay. As usual, I got ahead of myself, but there they are. Okay. Accelerating Maine's transition to light-duty electric vehicles, including plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. First action was to expand our electric vehicle charging stations statewide. We've already done a really good job. I'm not sure, Michael probably knows what the number this week is. I can't keep track of it. One week it's 1,200 charging stations, the next week it's 1,300, the next week 14, and so on and so on. But we're actually in a really good place for our fleet right now. I think folks have probably seen some of the media reports that we actually have more chargers per vehicle than just about any place in the country. That's great. We need more, though. If we're going to meet our electrification targets, we will need additional electric vehicle charging stations. The good news is over the next 4 years, we have identified about $52 million for public charging. There's going to be a lot more charging stations, fast chargers, level 2 chargers, and chargers in over 50 communities that are disadvantaged. Another priority would be electric vehicle education for drivers, dealers, and employers. Drivers, we constantly hear that, I don't know where to charge. I'd love to buy an EV, but there's not enough charging out there. That's a need. We need to get the word out. We need education for dealers. So a lot of dealers who are apprehensive about selling electric vehicles because they don't understand them. They don't understand the market. There are barriers, or at least perceived barriers, to their participation. And finally, education for employers. Be great if employers were providing incentives, free charging, or even just putting up charging stations at their places of work. Targets for EVs, including low and moderate income drivers. As a result of the modeling that the Climate Council is going to be doing, we're going to be developing targets for EV adoption. Support EV adoption through policy. There's a lot of policies out there for both the utility sector, from buildings and infrastructure that can help support the adoption of electric vehicles. So there are things we can do that essentially encourage the adoption of vehicles through make-ready type activities. And then finally, we would like to increase EV rebates for all drivers, particularly for low and moderate income drivers. So right now, there are a number of programs out there at the federal and state level providing EV rebates, but we need to increase those. We need to provide additional incentives for drivers to adopt the technology. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Joyce, who will be telling us about vehicle miles traveled, and medium and heavy-duty vehicle electrification. Thank you.
Okay, this is really a big part of what our group talked about a lot was the vehicle miles traveled. And one thing that we had a lot of conversation about was transit, and that transit needs to be easy, affordable, and fast. We had, I think Jean is here, she told a story about trying to go from South Portland to Portland, and I think it took her 2 hours on transit. So obviously that's not a mode of choice for many people. When it's not convenient. Again, we talked about education and awareness about things like riding a bike and walking and the benefits of it and how to do it safely, as well as riding transit and what that looks like in Maine. The goals for more buses, bikes, and carpooling. I'm not sure that we had the Go Maine carpool on this event, but just trying to get people on something like this carpool, try to take advantage of that, and biking, and also more routes, more flexibility in terms of being able to get a bus, and that there's just more availability in terms of you being able to pick a ride that meets your time frame. And invest in low carbon transportation when expanding roads. So one of the things we talked about that's in the weeds is if there is new capacity transportation in Maine, new roads, that we would look at mitigating with low carbon methods or low carbon modes. And that was a commitment that Maine DOT and the Turnpike said that they were willing to make. So that was one of the things that we put in as a recommendation. Help people try and buy e-bikes. This is especially helpful with an equity background. I can tell you that Maine DOT and Department of Labor have been sponsoring very small pilot project with e-bikes to get people in recovery back to work. It's been phenomenally successful to date. Really interesting how that's working out. Study the emissions impacts of buses and bikes. One of the things, a lot of the data is really old, like at least 10 years old. There's a lot of the studies are sort of speculation about how much active biking and walking would really save you from a greenhouse gas reduction point of view. And so we were saying, we really don't have the data to make informed decisions, and we need to try to figure out like what that data looks like, because you've got some studies that say it makes a big difference. You have other studies that said it makes no difference. And so you're trying to figure out like what is the answer there. Expand the Go Maine carpool program, have intercity and rural van bus pilots. Like we're very open to like, let's try some things. Let's try to see if people will ride a van together. Let's try to see if people, will use this to go to work. And what if we use electric vans because we might be actually putting more vehicle miles on the road if we're getting more people to where they need to be. And then make roads safer for biking and walking. I think this also gets at housing and land use, because honestly, if you can get people to want to live in that community, that village, it's just, I think we could all say that it's more economically vibrant when people are able to walk and bike in their village and feel like they can get around and it's safe. And what I can tell you at DOT, being chief engineer, is what people say to me is, I don't feel safe. I don't want to walk. I don't want to ride a bike with my family if I don't feel safe. So safety is really paramount. And I think the other thing in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, there's so much synergy with health benefits, economic vibrance. I mean, there's lots of good reasons to do this other than reduction of carbon emissions. So one thing that we also talked, and not as much about zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. We talked about expanding the electric and hybrid buses and ferries. The Maine State Ferry Service has a plan that they're working on right now. And again, pilot electric trucks and buses to show how they work. There's a lot of skepticism in the state about northern climates and range and power availability. And so let's just try to get some out here and see if they'll work. And then I think this is a really key one, develop fleet electrification advisory services. Help, I've personally talked to a company that wants to go electric. They have a business model to make it happen. They've really, really struggled to get information to be able to do it. It's been really difficult to figure out who to go to. And so I think this is a really big key. Those people who want to do it, give them some technical assistance, and then some more incentives for vans, trucks, and buses. We actually, my bad, Molly, I should have corrected this, but it actually talked about, rather than implement the clean transportation roadmap, because we haven't seen it yet, we haven't seen the recommendations, was to build upon those recommendations. And so that was a big discussion we had at the group. So I want to clarify that for my friends on the working group. And then we had some interesting comments from the priority population. I think housing came up, and in particular, it's kind of like, I don't know why I want to talk about EV charging stations when I don't have housing. That's important to me. And so that was sort of one of the themes I think the Mitchell Center picked up on, that people can't see themselves in an EV in moderate low income when they're trying to figure out their housing crisis. Again, this is a big issue in Maine. I think we saw this I think the pandemic really shined a light on how people were really isolated if they couldn't get a ride from somebody. But people don't have cars. A lot of people in Maine don't have cars or a reliable car, and they don't have a way to get to the doctor, to get food, to get their kids to events, to do things that I think a lot of us take for granted. And so that was something about, from an equity standpoint, some of these recommendations, especially in VMT, really get at equity issues as well. And then I think some other things, there was actually a really good news story about Washington County a couple months ago, and the problems with transportation security and people not having rides, as well as, we had some expanded public transportation. People are looking for some way to get to where they need to go. And so this is an opportunity also to electrify buses. We have some electric buses in the state that are working well. If we all remember that horrible day, what was it, a year ago, when it was like 40 below zero or something, the buses were working, the electric buses in Portland, so they did work. And then availability, schedule, location, and ease in terms of public transportation. We heard that over and over again, like I have to wait so long to get a ride, then I have to wait so long to get another ride home. And then the focus groups that the Mitchell Center had were not aware of Go Maine as a carpooling service, but they were excited to hear about it. So there's some work for Maine DOT to do to promote that program. And then there were just concerns, and this, I think there's a lot of, I know I get asked all the time about mining and battery disposal, the cost of them. Also, fire keeps coming up. That's a new hot topic, fire with EVs. So a lot of things. But I think some of the things that we talked about is, the transit really came up. Especially the public EV charging. We have a lot of it in the state. We can do more. We can make people feel more comfortable from a range anxiety point of view. Bike, car, it's supposed to say car share programs was one of the things that came up. We talked about, one of our members works with an elderly population, and she had some ideas. And then EV cost and charging availability. So that was really, we put a lot of stuff in. I think we met our 10 minutes. We were the bad ones last time, so we were like the ones who got told, do not go over 10 minutes. So it was a lot of work, but we appreciate David's help, and thank you for all the working group members who are out there.
If people didn't catch that number, it was $52 million invested in charging over the coming years. So $52 million of federal money and other money. So extraordinary what Maine's about to go through in the coming years. All right, Michael, Kathleen, you're up. Come on up. I will get your slides here, and please introduce yourselves. And I'll just note for both of you, there's this little handy timer right here. It'll count down.
I wanted to note that especially for our group.
Providing information.
Hi, everybody. I am Kathleen Meal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance, and I have had the honor of co-chairing the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group along with Michael Stoddard, who's Executive Director of Efficiency Maine Trust. Oh, see, it is, you're right. We had a really terrific multidisciplinary working group with members who represent a bunch of different perspectives on Maine's buildings. We had community advocates and architects and engineers, affordable housing experts, weatherization contractors, organized labor, municipal and state leaders. It went on and on. Thank you all for your insights, your expertise, and your time over the last many, many months. Thanks to all the members of the public who participated, and a special thanks to Molly Siegel, who staffed our working group, and to David Plum, who facilitated. You kept us organized and focused, and for anyone who has worked with me and Michael, you know what a task that is. Our working group was charged with updating and supplementing strategies to modernize Maine's buildings so that the places that we live, work, learn, and gather are safe, comfortable, energy efficient, and resilient to climate change. The strategies and actions outlined in Maine Won't Wait gave us a really good place to start. And our first two recommendations were essentially to keep it up and keep doing better, to continue the exceptional progress that we've made as a state on making homes and businesses more energy efficient with weatherization and clean heating and cooling systems, and also to really level up the impact of increasingly climate-friendly building codes and standards. Our next two recommendations reflect new areas of focus or deeper focus for the working group. We drilled down into specific strategies to promote the manufacture and use of climate-friendly building products, and like many of our fellow working groups, applied an adaptation lens as we explored measures that both reduce carbon and enhance resilience. Our last two recommendations each address a specific sector. Industrial processes represent unique end uses with unique opportunities to accelerate decarbonization. And with publicly funded buildings, we have a unique funding source, our dollars, that presents unique opportunities. So together, these recommendations build on all of our progress and leverage new funding and public engagement, and we can't wait to dig into them. So Michael's going to take the first one.
Thanks, Kathleen. We, as Kathleen mentioned, had a starting point of a pretty robust set of recommendations and targets that were established in the original Climate Action Plan back in 2000. And so we spent a bunch of time in this work group just reviewing what those targets were and what kind of progress we were making. And I think that was helpful, and it really helped direct us to more refined discussion and recommendations for how to go forward, how to improve on what we've already built. A big part of that set of targets was to weatherize 35,000 homes by 2030 and to dramatically accelerate the rate of fuel switching off of high carbon fuels to high efficiency heat pumps running on an electric grid that's getting cleaner and cleaner. So a lot of our discussion was around how are we doing with weatherizing, how are we doing with switching to heat pumps, how are we doing on the equity elements of advancing both of those targets. And there was generally good news to report. We are on track with hitting weatherization targets. We have funding in place that should get us to the 2030 target. There have been some new policies enacted for heat pumps to help fund heat pump programs at the state level that have been really nicely complemented by funding at the federal level. So we're able to do it now in a wide variety of buildings and to have the funds to pay for that. So big progress being made now with low-income and moderate-income households in Maine, switching over to include multifamily buildings where renters live in Maine, getting them switched over to high efficiency, low carbon heating systems that are well insulated. So lots of good things to point to there. And to some degree, this is staying the course, but there are areas for improvement going forward. A couple of policies that were noted that we might want to think about going forward is to make sure that to look at policies and make sure they're all pulling in the same direction now that we know that's our target. And so, for example, we noticed that there are sales taxes on the sale of electricity for residential customers, but not on any other heating fuel that you use in the state. Well, why would we have that if our goal is to switch to more people over to electricity? So maybe that's something we should look at. Also, over time, not immediately, but maybe in the future, should we look at emission standards for those heating systems? Should we try to gradually ratchet that up over time? So those were some things we wanted to look at. And I'll jump away and come back.
So we know that adopting and implementing building codes leads to safer, more efficient, and more resilient buildings, and that those benefits compound as building codes become increasingly climate friendly. So that's probably not surprising, but some of the data might be. Compared to the 2015 International Energy Conservation Code, there's an estimate that a home built to the 2021 code will have a life cycle energy savings of almost $24,000 and a statewide emissions impact of almost 400,000 metric tons of CO2. Those savings will just get more and more impressive as we approach net zero building energy codes by 2035. But we do have a ways to go because Maine is still operating with the 2015 code. So we still haven't seen that jump yet to the 2021 code, but we're really optimistic that moving building codes to the new Office of Community Affairs will support more rapid code adoption and more robust training and technical assistance. That is really important because while the building code applies in every community in Maine, not every community has the resources it needs to implement that code. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how to get those resources to the communities that need them to make sure that communities can benefit from the safer and more efficient codes. I also do want to mention that there's a class of buildings that is not subject to Maine's building codes. Manufactured or mobile homes are actually regulated at the federal level. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how to increase the efficiency and make that segment of our housing, which is an increasingly big chunk of new homes in Maine, as energy efficient as possible. And there's a new federal program that came in with the Inflation Reduction Act to make zero energy ready mobile homes. So we're excited about that.
Another strategy that was identified in Maine Won't Wait was to complement our efforts in buildings with reducing the emissions from those buildings through the heating systems, to also look at the building materials that we use in those buildings, because there's a wide variety and they have different embodied carbon associated with them. There are different types of insulation. For example, we have a manufacturer in the state that makes insulation from wood fiber, and there are ways to take forest products and make materials that are as strong as steel or concrete and can be substituted for them in the right situations. There are some examples of those buildings being put up in Maine now. For example, the USM Student Center and Dormitory used a lot of CLT and other low embodied carbon content materials. So one of the recommendations is to figure out how we can do more of that in Maine, more education about it, more tracking and counting of what is the embodied carbon of the materials we're using. A very good potential starting place is with buildings that are publicly funded, and so that was one of our recommendations.
So a lot of what we have talked about today, weatherization, building codes, high efficiency heating and cooling, all of those things have resilience benefits. For example, more energy efficient buildings have longer what we call passive survivability. So the amount of time that a building is comfortable in the event of a power outage. This winter storm, this has been a refrain throughout the morning, really highlighted the need to foster greater resilience. And so we talked about basic steps like having flood insurance and some pumps with battery backups, but also more complex and powerful steps to reduce the energy burden and demand on the electric grid through really thoughtful deployment of community and building scale distributed energy resources. There are already there's some interesting overlaps here with the energy working group, and we spent a lot of time talking about that, but not as much time as we're talking about it this morning, so I'm gonna let Michael keep going.
One category of recommendations from Maine Won't Wait that we were pretty light on last time was the industrial sector. Partly that's because factories in Maine had already done a lot of the early, easy work that there is to do in a factory with improved energy efficiency and getting off of heavy fuels onto natural gas was what mostly happened in the 2000s. But what about the next step? So that was part of what we discussed this time around. There are new emerging applications of heat pump technology that can approach temperatures that will provide process steam, and that's what a lot of industrial folks need. And so it's exciting to think about piloting some of those applications in Maine factories, Maine paper mills, and other places like that. Also, membrane filtration is a new technology that's emerging. It appears to be very cost effective and can help displace the use of oil and other heavy fossil fuels in some of those applications. So our thought was, because we have some of those big users in Maine, and because there are new federal programs to help support that, we should concentrate our efforts there.
We should do all of the things that we can do when it comes to the buildings that we're in charge of, right? So the lead by example initiatives at the state level have been really powerful. We want to keep it up, and our working group went deep in 2 categories of publicly funded buildings, the more than 600 school buildings in Maine, and affordable housing. Hannah mentioned that we got to take some really cool field trips, and that included affordable housing that is built to passive house standards. We do know how to do a lot of what needs to be done in Maine's building sector. We know there's a tremendous need. We have the experience, the opportunity, and a lot of new funding available to act on it. The challenge is fitting it all together. So this is a quote from an older Mainer who participated in one of the focus groups from the Mitchell Center, who said, "There's so much information out there. It's so confusing. After reviewing everything, I don't know what I'm eligible for." This is somebody who knows that there's an opportunity. They know there are resources available, and they're still struggling to make sense of it all. Priority populations shared a lot of competing needs that mean that barrier to figuring out how to weave it all together might be enough to keep them from doing it at all. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to make sure that we're getting these strategies deployed equitably throughout the state. Lots more to say on that, but we're out of time.
Well, all right. Thanks, Michael and Kathleen. And Maine indeed is a leader in heat pumps. It's remarkable. So, all right. So, Energy Working Group, we have Selena Cunningham, and she'll introduce herself, not as one of the co-chairs, but there's a reason for that. Selena, take it away. Top button does the advancing slide.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm Selena Cunningham, the Deputy Director in the Maine Governor's Energy Office. Dan Burgess and Ken Coburn, the co-chairs of the Energy Working Group, regret that they can't be here today, but alas, shoulder surgery and a long-awaited family vacation have kept them away, despite the pull of Melanie and Hannah and the Climate Council. So we're happy to have many members of the Energy Working Group in the audience today. And so here's the list, and I just want to start by, both from the co-chairs and me, thanking the Energy Working Group members for their hard work over the last 6 months. We have a broad array of people with diverse experiences throughout the energy sector that worked together thoughtfully, respectfully, and collaboratively to help us shape recommendations that will really make this a better climate action plan. So again, just appreciate the effort. I also want to acknowledge Caroline Colin from the Energy Office, who was tremendous in staffing this working group, as well as David. We would not have had the recommendations we would without their hard work. So here are the 4 recommendations from the Energy Working Group. We started the conversation with thinking about how, as a state, are we going to deliver clean, affordable, and reliable clean energy for all Maine people. And so there are 4 big areas that we started thinking of from the very beginning. The first is related to energy burden. How can we address and reduce energy burden for all Maine people, with a particular focus on low and middle income households? And we can make sure that all families and communities are benefiting from the energy transition and that we're not leaving anyone behind. The second recommendation is around clean energy infrastructure. We know that we need infrastructure to support and meet our climate and clean energy goals. And so we have experienced over the last several years, since we've implemented a number of laws related to clean energy, and have experiences that we wanted to bring and strengthen the recommendations of this next climate action plan that really focus on how are we going to deliver the infrastructure necessary in a way that is predictable and works for communities, as well as making sure that we can do so in a cost-effective manner. The third recommendation is a new one for the climate plan, and that is related to energy demand management. And this is in a related innovative ways to reduce peak load on the grid. And this is critical to make sure that we reduce the overall infrastructure necessary to meet our climate goals as we're increasing the the demand from electricity, from whether it's transportation or buildings or home heating. And so we want to make sure that we're reducing that peak load from energy demand management and other technologies. And so we know that we will need to collaborate with our other working groups and other sectors in order to work on some of those specific recommendations. And then finally, we've made a lot of progress in terms of clean energy workforce. Just recently, we've passed 15,000 clean energy jobs towards the goal of 30,000 by 2030. We can build on the work already done, and we have a recommendation focused on that. So delving into a little bit more detail around energy burdens, our proposed actions speak to Maine's needs to better understand the full spectrum of energy burdens for households. So it's not about electricity burden, it's about overall energy, whether it's what kind of fuel are you using to heat your home, to heat your water, as well as what kind of fuel are you using for your vehicles. And so when we think about the information that people have, we want to make sure that they have a full spectrum of how those costs are, how their families are, the bigger picture in terms of the amount of funding that they're using for this energy, as well as the savings that come from the energy, clean energy transition. And so the group recommended Maine set a target for reducing that overall energy burden among low and medium income families. The group also recommended initiatives to help households navigate the programs and opportunities to lower costs and participate in the energy transition, as well as strategies to reduce barriers such as high upfront costs. Finally, the group recommended that the state identify adequate funding to support energy assistance programs. And so to ensure that we are meeting our clean energy goals and state requirements, we need to build clean energy resources. And we have a number of complementary actions related to building the infrastructure. And that includes making sure that we have regular clean energy procurements, that we are supporting communities in aiding their decision-making around siting, as well as updating our permitting processes. And so the group talked about a number of different specific recommendations of how we can do this, how we can use federal funding that is available to help communities and to help the state and others develop plans and actually take steps to make sure that we're able to build this infrastructure in our communities. We know that this is essential to meeting our climate goals. And then regarding the manage the impacts of buildings, vehicles, industry on the grid with load flexibility and innovation. If Ken were here, he would use the analogy of a highway. And if we all got on the highway at the same time, we would have a traffic jam. And the easy solution to that is having people leave a few minutes later, and so that you can have less congestion on the highway. The same situation is happening with the grid. If everyone turns their light on or charges their vehicle at the same time, we will have a traffic jam on the grid. But if we just make minor changes, like programs that allow people to change the hours that they're charging their EV in a way that doesn't disrupt their activities in their home, we can make sure we're reducing that congestion on the grid. That lowers costs overall for in terms of less infrastructure needed. And so there are a number of specific recommendations we focused on, and this is also an area where we worked with the other working groups. There's work happening now at Efficiency Maine Trust, other places in the state, and there are lessons from across the country that we can bring to Maine in terms of how do we bring more changes to our demand management to lower those costs and increase reliability. And lastly, related to the clean energy workforce, I think this is a good news story for the state. We have recommendations that build on the work that's already happened, including supporting apprenticeships, making sure that we have innovative partnerships working with businesses and others that are out there working to train young people and people transitioning from other industries into the clean energy workforce. Also focusing on disadvantaged populations and how can we make sure that we are connecting people to the clean energy workforce. I'll also say from a state perspective, we think about how can there are multiple workforce initiatives across the state. How can we complement other activities that are happening in this space to make sure that we have the people available to build the projects that we need and how everyone can benefit economically from them. And like other working groups, we heard from the Mitchell Center and their work talking to priority populations as well as people from across Maine. And this is just one example of one of the comments that came in. And we were reassured by the fact that this is one of the areas that we're really focusing on how to reduce the energy burden for Maine people, and believe that we have recommendations that help speak to that. And similarly, we heard regarding the surveys that Maine people are looking for affordable, renewable energy solutions, and they also believe that cost, public perception, and lack of understanding are key barriers. We put forward recommendations to really address that, and we're looking forward to the dialogue with the rest of the Climate Council to make sure that we can do this in a thoughtful, collaborative way, recognizing that a lot of these topics intersect our different working groups. And thank you very much.
Excellent. Great. All right, so now Hannah's going to talk about this land use cross-cutting group that was set up, and I'll let her explain it.
Great. So we call this a discussion group since we were very, compared to the other working groups, we met twice. And I will just say the reason we met twice, and I'll actually go back. So we included all of the co-chairs. You have heard throughout this day the issues of land use come up over and over again. And I would say we invited all of the co-chairs as well as working group members to participate with us in these two conversations that were action-packed. And why were we kind of breaking this out separately? I think you've heard throughout the day, and I think every one of you probably lives in a community in Maine, and you see the constant, I think, tension and opportunity between land use and our climate goal intersections. Just a few of the bubbles up here. How do we prioritize development that meets housing and workforce needs while reducing transportation emissions? How do we site clean energy infrastructure to achieve the state mandates and targets cost effectively and responsibly? How do we meet Maine's climate goals that prioritize increasing Maine-grown food consumption, protecting natural and working lands for habitats, heritage industries, and recreation? How do we ensure we meet our very aggressive carbon sequestration requirements? How do we manage natural working lands' ability to support climate resilience, like the benefits of coastal marshes? So I will just say these are all of the things that we want to do, we know as a state are important to do. But the challenge is they intersect and they sometimes conflict. And I think the point of the task force was to quickly develop recommendations in the context of both the challenges we face, like the housing crisis, growth opportunities, the jobs and economic benefits that our state sees in front of them, as well as our climate goals. We recognize that Maine communities, whether they are rural or urban, need support in implementing effective land use policies that achieve intersecting goals and navigate the conflicts that arise, the challenging conversations, and how do we think thoughtfully about regional differences and different priorities in different parts of our state. I will say, what you're about to see in terms of our recommendations is there are not silver bullets. I think all of this work is really about we need to carefully think about the conflicts and help determine how do we as a state help community policymakers who make a lot of these decisions, regional governments who often support these decisions, as well as state policymakers who do play a role in terms of incentive programs, requirements, regulations. We all have a role in this. And again, there is no simple solution, but we need to be constantly intentional about how we are managing, I would say, conflicting goals. So this is not new. I know there are some housing legislators in the room who've worked really hard on these issues over the last couple of years. The state of Maine has at times had incredibly robust programs, and we are continuing to focus on how do we promote smart growth to reduce emissions, prevent natural and working land conversion, and create affordable housing. That was kind of that's sort of an overarching strategy that encompasses many of the things that the Climate Council wants to do, the things that our state is struggling with in terms of the housing crisis, and how do we do it in a way that makes sense. So I would say we came up with 3 goals in this conversation, and the first goal is really overarching, and the second 2 kind of serve that first goal. So again, I won't read everything on here. I think these are the things you actually heard many of the co-chairs already raise, but we know we need to do better as a state. We know we are often turning down housing developments in certain parts of our state. And what does that lead to? It probably will lead to the need for that housing to sprawl and use valuable farmland, working lands in a different way. We know that conversations around clean energy are important and challenging, and we need to be thoughtful. We need to be able to build clean energy on disturbed lands where it's possible. And we know we probably need to go beyond that. So how do we thoughtfully site the transmission lines, the clean energy resources our state needs? You heard a lot today about natural working lands. We talked about the importance of our forest product sector, the incredible goals and importance of our agricultural sector in meeting our other climate goals. We all as a state, we know we really value our natural lands, recreation. That is why so many people come to Maine and live in Maine. Again, our ability to focus and concentrate growth and responsibly cite projects that we know our state needs, that is at the crux of this challenge and the importance of why we can't sort of just say those issues are hard, I'm not going to focus on them. We know our ability to accomplish all of our climate goals really comes down to land use very often. So 2 other, the kind of how do we do it? We know that technical assistance to communities, proactive communication and engagement is a slog. It's what I know David does day after day. Having hard conversations and planning intentionally, that is how we get there. And again, there's not a silver bullet, but literally every community needs sort of thoughtful support from the state level, at the local level, at the regional level to think about how we do this. We talked a lot in our conversations about messaging. There's lots of misconceptions about different types of development, but there are opportunities to have local conversations about what communities want to see, to understand how this has worked in other parts of the state, sort of the ideal solutions that have worked elsewhere. We know there's lots of technical assistance, whether it's model ordinances, whether it's planning specifically in growth areas like the state has done with housing. There are many opportunities, but we need to be clear that they need to happen, and they need to happen across our state. So the last one is sort of both the carrots and the sticks. What are both the incentives to these kinds of activities, as well as the requirements and regulations that can really help this come together? So we're doing this to both, again, reduce emissions, foster vibrant community centers, reduce sprawl, and provide measurable benefits. So again, a lot of similar themes. So how do we support affordable housing in locations near services? How do we protect natural and working lands as we do community planning? How do we support adaptation and resilience strategies for heritage industries? This could be for our northern forests or for our coastal lands where, again, you heard this morning about real challenges in terms of access to the ocean. Those are land use conversations. We know that data can inform these, and the state is already undertaking data projects, but we know we need to do a much better job. From agricultural lands to the siting of clean energy, the opportunities to use high resolution data can really better help inform communities as they make these decisions. We need to prioritize projects that mitigate environmental and community risk. And there's a lot of debate about prioritization. Is that jumping the line? Is that making the permitting process clear? Is it supporting our permitting agencies at the local level or the Department of Environmental Protection to ensure that they have the resources to make these decisions quickly, thoughtfully, predictably? We know that all of those things need to happen. And last but not least, the financial solutions to undertake these actions, especially our smallest rural communities are really struggling with these decisions at the local level, and the state's ability to partner in terms of this level of decision making is incredibly important. So I will just say that this strategy has a lot of details. I highly encourage you to read our now online all of the ideas we came up with in these three strategies. I will say they are a roadmap for how states and communities can partner on these issues. They implicate nearly every state agency and every community in Maine in terms of how we think about land use. We know it overlaps with, again, the bold goals the governor has set out on housing, the bold goals we have on land preservation, the bold goals we have on clean energy. So I would just encourage you all to read the strategies. I thank our staff who helped put them together so rapidly. And again, this was an area where we got a diverse group of people where there are disagreements. This is an issue rife with disagreements. But I think we were able to settle on these things absolutely make sense, and they are urgently needed to support our goals. So I will end there and pass it back to David, and that's all I got.
All right. So we have a little time for questions, and I have the same question prepped up for this panel as I had for the previous one, right? And if you remember, that question was, over these past months, what is one learning, one aha moment that really shaped your thinking about this work, and perhaps even your whole working group's thinking about the work? So again, I did whisper this question to them ahead of time, so they had some time to think about it. But we can just go down the panel if you want to say, like, what's a moment, what's an aha thing, I think it was on, that shaped the way you thought about this process. Jeff?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure it was an aha or an epiphany, but, even though we had a very diverse group with many different opinions, not necessarily all on the same page, somewhere along the process, we started to coalesce. And I think that is perhaps best exampled by, Joyce had mentioned a recommendation to provide mitigation for highway projects or transportation, new transportation projects that would increase greenhouse gas emissions. So at that point in time, it's like, wow, I think we're all on the same page. And ultimately, we did end up on the same page. We had pretty good consensus. Actually, we had true consensus. I think everybody agreed with the final recommendations, even though some folks would have liked to have gone further in either direction.
I would say that for me, if I could step outside of the working group for a minute, when we had the December storm, the morning after the storm, our bridge maintenance engineer called me at like 7:10 in the morning. And let me preface this by saying bridge engineers are not known for being drama queens. They are very like straight, like they're just even. And he got on the phone and he literally was yelling, "Oh my God, Western Maine is Armageddon. I can't get to the bridges. I can't see them. I don't know what's open. I don't know what's washed away." And I think for me, it was a affirmation that this work we're doing is important. And I think that we have been pretty fortunate that we haven't had more of those storm events, to be honest. And I think that, you know, I often say, I speak a lot of times at transportation events and national events, and they're not always known for being left of leaning. And I say to them, I'm not going to ask you if you believe in climate change, but I am going to ask you, do you think climate's changing? And they all say yes across the country. And so I think for me, you know, we have something to fight for, and whether, you know, we have to take care of our piece of the pie, if you will. And I think it was helpful to go back to the working group, knowing that we were seeing some impacts in the state.
Yeah, and before I jump over to Michael, Kate Dempsey had a question about culverts earlier, and I know there's a nice story about culverts in that storm, right? About new culverts and how they performed.
Really, both the state and the towns didn't lose a lot of culverts, and especially new culverts. We didn't lose any bridges. We lost some approaches to bridges. Some towns lost bridges, but a lot of the newer culverts that have been built with the newer design standards, which are bigger and wider, lasted. And I think that's something when you talk about getting power companies to homes, EMS services, and people being able to access food and being able to get out, that's a really critical thing, that people can access the road system.
And the fish can get through too.
Yes, they can.
Michael, what's a learning?
Similar to Joyce, the series of storms that we had this winter opened my eyes to some additional reasons and for switching to heat pumps and to the benefits of heat pumps, and specifically what I'm thinking of, well, two things. One is we've done a bunch of analysis in the last couple of years about how the heat pumps are performing, the ones that have been put in over the last 10 years. And we're learning more and more that they are performing really well, even at very extreme cold temperatures. We didn't have a very cold winter this winter, but we did the year before. And even when it was negative 16 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat pumps that we had little measuring equipment attached to were spitting out 90-degree Fahrenheit air. So they work when it gets really cold. And now that we know that, we've adjusted our emphasis to being more on people converting their whole home or their whole business to low carbon, high efficiency heat pump systems instead of the alternatives. But what happened in these storms that I hadn't really appreciated as another reason is that a lot of homes were inundated with flood waters. And in some cases, the old oil tanks that are down there in the basement were lifted up off their stands and flipped over and spilled. It's not funny. It's a mess. So we've known that people were kind of excited about getting a little more real estate out back in their basement where they could put other things and not have to have that big clunky oil tank that sometimes is leaking a little bit and definitely is at risk of flipping over if you get too much water down there. And now that we know heat pumps are actually good enough to do the job through the entire winter, especially if you have some little supplements here and there, it's starting to feel like a really viable option to make the whole shift over. So that was a revelation.
And avoid that leaky oil tank in the storm. Kathleen?
So one of the frustrating things about the buildings working group is a lot of the things that are top of mind for Maine people when you say, talk to me about housing, are not actually the charge of our working group, right? We weren't talking about location of housing. We weren't focused on how much housing is being built. We weren't focused on the cost of housing. And so you have a lot of, well, no, we're not going to talk about that right now. It is important. Other people are working on it, but we're focused on this. And then we learned about the zero energy ready manufactured homes, which have this ability to answer that question about housing that's affordable to Maine people at all income levels and housing that is really high performance. So this new certification program that came in with the Inflation Reduction Act could actually get manufactured homes that are solar ready, so they've got the roofs are strong enough, the electrical's all set up, and manufacturers of those homes are eligible for a $5,000 per unit federal tax credit. That could be a game changer, especially when you look at the fact that about 20% of new homes in Maine have been manufactured homes in recent years. So that's really exciting, and that, especially when you think about the opportunity that we have at the state level to layer in incentives for the consumer. Who knows what we'll come up with, but it's pretty exciting.
Nice. Love that.
Speaking of exciting, I will channel one of our co-chairs who really was excited about the conversation around load flexibility and demand management. And his aha moment was when 3 different working groups came together and attracted the interest of the federal government to join our conversation, showing that Maine is really leading the way in terms of trying to figure out how to work on these challenging, complex, sticky issues and come up with clear recommendations that not only will help Maine, but will help provide an example for other states around the country. So I think the convening and the coordination that we were able to achieve in this conversation that is new for this action plan.
Yeah. Thanks, Selena.
My aha moment. Well, I already told you the aha moment was there is no easy solution. We wanted that perfect land use thing that we could deliver up to you all. But I would say in our conversation, we talked about examples of many, many communities in Maine who are slogging, and I'm sure all of their select board members and city councilor members have, marks on their back because they're doing this work. They are figuring out how to site, quality affordable housing in Madison, Maine for employees in a way that is walkable to work. We have communities who have made decisions about how to site renewable energy in a responsible way, and they should be really proud about the way they've planned for it. We have communities who are now thinking about these coastal storms, and we were just down in Stonington, where they're thinking about the land and the working waterfront land assets the community has, and what happens if they are lost to private ownership and turned to summer homes. How do they deal with year-round people who are, living in homes that may not last in the next storm? Same kinds of conversations they're having in riverfront communities in Western Maine. Joyce talked about the storms that hit really both parts of the state. So the aha moment is that we are dealing with these land use issues, and we have an opportunity to take the examples of towns who are doing the hard work to plan and doing it well and share those examples with the rest of the state. It may not convince everybody, but we actually think that kind of this town is doing it and it's working for their town and sharing it with other towns who might be skeptical. We think that could make a big difference.
That's wonderful. All right. They've put the lunch out in the back, so we're all scenting this wafting flavors of your impending lunch. So I think we should stop here. We're not going to do questions. I want to say a big thank you. Before we do, let me make sure you know when to come back.
Oh wait, we have a video. Can we send them off?
We do have a video. Hang on one second. And after that video, we're going to come back and we're going to start at 12:50. All right. So 10 minutes before the hour is when we're going to start up. Before we do the video, I want to do a big thank you to this panel. So Thanks, everyone.
Good job, panel.
Okay, so before we break for lunch, there is a video, and Hannah, can you introduce it?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Since we like to inspire you, and it is always good to see the good things happening in the world, I wanted to feature this new Climate and Me project that the Maine Climate Council, Amara Fiji, our awesome rock star youth member, Abigail Hain in our office, and lots of other folks collaborated on how we engage young people in climate challenges, in climate careers, in ways to make a difference, in a way that is inspiring in what can sometimes be an overwhelming issue, but how do we think about how to engage young people across the state? I think this is just another opportunity. Lots of good shout outs to our youth members of all of our working groups and task forces. You'll see some of them featured in this video. I would just encourage you all after watching it to go check out the Climate and Me website, which you can find out at mainewon'twait.org, and share this. I think it's probably going to be inspiring to all of you, not just young people, but certainly I think it's a tangible and thoughtful way to think about how all the differences young people are making in our state on this issue right now. So with that,
let's watch the video.
See
And
up the video.
Yeah, panelists, you're welcome to get down in your chairs to be able to see it, because up here you can't see a thing. But yes, tech folks, if you want to run the video, that'd be great.
You know, our world can change like in a second. I don't want to be silent, and I want to speak up.
My passion for climate justice started when I was really young. My dad was always talking about it.
This is a place that I've grown up. Personally, I want to stay in Maine.
I don't want to lose these places. I want to fight for them.
So great to see everyone here on such a gorgeous day. The state of Maine's youth is really energized and ready to take action on so many things.
Anybody can get involved on some level to personally invest themselves in creating a better future.
My end goal would be in city planning, looking at how we can implement sustainability in our everyday lives.
I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. Heat pumps are the most efficient heating source. They're ultimately helping our environment.
I feel like we talk about statistics a lot when we talk about climate change, and I really wanted to turn statistics into stories, which led me to writing my debut novel, Changes in the Weather.
Young people will be the leaders of these communities soon enough. I think a lot of adults think they listen, and they don't listen actively, and that's something I feel really passionate about, is this intergenerational collaboration.
I'm a youth rep on the Maine Climate Council's Coastal and Marine Working Group. During my first meeting, one of them said something to me that really stuck out. They said that my presence there reminded them of the urgency of the situation.
It's important for our generation to get involved with climate change because we're the ones that are going to be living in this environment for years and years to come.
The youth voice needs to be centered in this discussion. We have a lot of creative things to share.
Maine is a leader in climate action nationally and internationally, and young people in Maine are also leaders.
When a lot of young people get together, it creates a more powerful movement.
I am young, but I am willing. And I am not alone.
We all get together and devote energy towards this issue. I think it's something that we can seriously mitigate.
I'm just really hopeful right now and really excited to see what is happening.
It's great because I actually feel like my voice is being heard.
Optimism and joy and hope are the essential ingredients for climate action.
Turning your passion into purpose. You can enter this conversation in so many different ways.
Climate and Me.
Climate and Me is planning for the future.
It's me speaking my voice.
Spreading the message through research and fiction.
It's using my words to change the world.
Climate and Me is connecting youth to climate action.
There's a place for everybody.